Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Business of Relationship podcast, BOR podcast. I'm your host, Mike Bell. Listen, gentlemen, if you missed last weekend, we had a phenomenal event, great event. Hosted by yours truly in the Business of Relationship family. First off, I want to give some shout outs that are definitely due. So shout out to Perry Jeffries, came out, laid down some financial truths as a financial specialist. He came out and we talked about generational wealth. He was able to bring up just some information about, the misconception of how wealth is built. All right. And we were able to ask some questions. We got into it, right? We didn't hold back. And as men, sometimes it can be hard to ask questions, or talk through finances, right? As a provider, that's what your general role is, to provide. But what we struggle with sometimes is really having that deep conversation and asking those questions about how to acquire wealth. What does wealth look like? What do we do with it, right? We have this concept that we just go to work and we work. And by doing that, we'll build wealth. Well, that's not how wealth is built. So Perry Jeffries, he was able to lay down the truth, right, on looking at from a different lens, and from a lens that he's been able to successfully build a model off of for his own business, right? Where are the banks keeping their money? That's a little bit of what he talked about, right? We think in our little savings accounts and, are getting back our little less than 1%, or even if you have a high yield interest account, right, maybe 2, 3%, 5% on the absolute max, but it's that where the banks are keeping their money, right? What percent are they getting in order for you to get back, your 2, 3%? So he was able to walk us through and talk a little bit through how he's built, some of his wealth, how he's helped other organizations and companies and people as well, his clients. And we were able to just get right down into it. Like, hey, listen, let's cure this misconception of how wealth is built. I remember back in the day, for me, I thought, saving money meant putting it underneath your mattress. Like, I did that for a minute. Up until, I was adult, there was no one there to really tell me. I learned how to save money. In my mind, saving money meant just not spending it. So I did a good job at not spending it, but I didn't do a good job at growing my money, right, when I was younger. Right. So I had that concept for a long time, and that's been passed down for generations, especially in certain communities where you just hold your money, put it underneath your mattress, and from there. And I remember it's funny because I reread the parable of the talents. Right. If you in the Bible, there's a parable that talks about the talents, where the Jesus talks about a master, and the master gives one 5 measures of talent, which is essentially a equivalency of like some sort of like currency, right, back in the day. So he gave 1 5 measure of talent, he gave 1 2, and into 1 he gave 1, right? So the master went away for a while and came back, and he checked out the one that had the 5 measures and said, hey, listen, what'd you do with your 5? He said, hey, I doubled it, here's your 10 back. And he said, okay. So he went to the one with 2, like, hey, what'd you do with your 2 measures? Let's see what you did. And he's like, hey, listen, I was able to double it for you, man. I got you 4. Right. And he went to the one with the 1 measure of talent and was like, hey, listen, all right, so everybody did their things. What about you? What'd you do? And he looked and he was like, hey, come here really quick. And he brought him over and he dug it up like, I kept it safe for you. He said, what? He said, I kept it safe for you. I wanted you. I know it's tough out there in the streets and it's been hard times out there. And I've been watching as, people have been losing a lot of money and this, that, and the other. So I buried it so that way when you got back, it'd be safe for you. And the master looks at him and was like, you lazy sloth. The worst thing, at least you could have put it in the bank and gained interest off of it, but you buried it and gained nothing off of it. That's lazy, right? And a lot of it comes from not only just being lazy, but just being uneducated. So we think that savings means to save it and not spend it. That's traditional term of saving, right? But Perry was able to walk us through and really take into that mindset, like what does investing really look like? Right. And not just, I want to buy some property and invest in that. Nah, there's still some expenses and everything else that comes with where are banks keeping some of their money? So he talked through, insurance on the insurance end. And I won't get into it. I'm not going to pretend like I'm some insurance guru at all. But he was able to really tell us, and talk through that. So we were able to talk a little bit about the truths of that. So some things that I've been able to take advantage of. By the way, if you haven't checked it out, make sure you check out Cash Flow Unlocked. So quick plug in there for Cash Flow Unlocked. There's some boot camps. Perry does an amazing job at keeping you being accountable, financially accountable. So as a financial strategist, he'll go through, he'll talk a little bit about, financial strategies, what he's been able to do and how he's been able to employ his entire family, and what he calls, not necessarily, what does he say? He has a financial term that he uses, where essentially you have your financial freedom, right? So how do you get to a point to creating your financial freedom? And what does that look like, right? So definitely check out Cash Flow Unlocked. Shout out to Perry Jeffries for coming out and talking to us a little bit about that. And we just got down to the real about it. And then we talked about mindset, right? So, ex-NFL player Purcell Gaskins came out, talked about mindset, right? And, just from a mindset, thinking of it from, as a king, right? So what's a king's mindset? When you have a family, and especially from a man's standpoint, like this is now your kingdom, right? And you got to protect your kingdom. So we talked about that mindset, right? What are we required to do? What should it look like from the top up going down? You've got a lot of people dependent on you. So what does that look like? A king doesn't have time to, when the wars are coming or when people are attacking your walls, you don't have time to panic. We don't have time to panic. You got to have a plan. And that plan happens because you had a plan before it even happened. A lot of us are walking around and we don't have a plan before it even happens. Right? We just allow stuff to happen and we keep reacting, and then we keep reacting, right? So what does your plan look like, right? The king, by the time war happens, the plan already had a plan, or the king already had a plan for war, right? If war were to ever break out, this is what it would look like. And now in the middle of war, now you take a strategy based on what's happening, right? Because you need to understand, there's different types of wars, different people do you know your enemy? And a lot of times, we don't take time to know our enemy. We just keep reacting to stuff. So, we talked a lot about mindset. We also talked about, flying as eagles, right? That at the end of the day, somebody asked a question about, is it wrong, to let go of people or to let people go, especially if it's family. And Purcell, he was just straight up. He said, listen, when you're an eagle, half the time you don't even have to worry about letting people go. There's an altitude that eagles get to fly at that most birds can't fly at. So as you ascend and as you continue to go up, the reality of it is that most birds can't fly at that altitude. So you just keep ascending. Yeah, does that mean at some point you got to ignore some people and you may not be able to hang out as much? Yeah, does that mean that, you don't love them anymore? No. But sometimes where you're headed, sometimes where God is taking you, or sometimes where you're going, other people can't go there. And as you reach that altitude, right, they end up staying down here. But what we find ourselves doing oftentimes is because we don't want to leave people behind. So we're an eagle that should be flying up here, but we come down to this level because we want to stay down here with the birds that aren't able to come up to this altitude. Right. And so the goal is, hey, if you're called to a higher calling, then you just got to fly up high. And the people that can stay up there with you and the birds, the other eagles that are up there with you, listen, you'll be flying with eagles, right? Or other birds that can be at that altitude. But never are you to settle, and settle down, and not be at that altitude. So we talked about mindset from a male perspective, as that leader of the household, as that king of that kingdom, right? What does that look like, right? And then we had a couple of local artists come out, Johnny K. So shout out to Johnny K stopping by. Happy belated birthday. So it was on his birthday. This event kind of came about. We talked about kind of celebrating, Johnny K's birthday on that day. So it was done actually on his birthday. So shout out to Johnny K. I appreciate you. We talked about emotionalism as well. So how he expresses emotionalism through his paintings. What does that look like, right? For men, oftentimes we feel like we can't really express how we feel, right? We're not allowed to express how we feel, right? In order to, and in doing so, I remember growing up, half the time it's like, oh man, stop crying like a little baby, right? And some other words we know that were used, right? And so because of that, you got used to not being able to express how you felt. And the only okay expression that was allowed, right, is anger, right? So anger was allowed, but not allowed, right? If you get angry, like, yeah, that's right, get tough, right? When you're playing football, when you get basketball, like, yeah, that's right, get angry, get mad, now go out there and do it. Those were okay emotions, right? But when you were ready to cry, right? When you were sad, when you were, maybe some of those, even when you were happy at times, what you smiling about? Why you so happy, smiling all the time? Something wrong with you, right? Those things there was like a negative connotation kind of built with, joy and other emotions outside of just sadness and anger. You know what I mean? So, as men just growing up and not having that opportunity to really feel safe to express. And not only that, just thinking about it, right? As a man, the goal is like, hey, you're supposed to hold it down for everybody else. So if you have feelings and if you don't have it under control, then at the end of the day, how does everybody else feel about that? Right now, all of a sudden, do people start to look at you different? Like, he's weak because he over there crying, or he's weak, because he has feelings, or he's weak because of X, Y, and Z. You ain't a real man, right? The definition of a real man, oftentimes, that real men don't have feelings. And that's so inaccurate, right? The only thing we do is we just harbor those feelings and they turn into something else. So when you don't get an opportunity to express sadness, it comes out half the time as anger. right? I remember losing my mom, and life, you know what I mean? That was early this year, unexpected. I talked to my mom on the phone a couple hours, you know what I mean, beforehand. Next thing you know, I get a call that she's gone. I'm like, what? Unexpected. I just talked to mom. You know what I mean? We were just laughing on the phone. What do you mean she's gone? There's no way. Doctor's on the phone, you know, telling me that she's gone. And man, I remember breaking down on the floor. I just broke down crying, you know. And then after that, you know, I had to pull it all together for, you know, family and friends and everybody else. Like, and there was work that still had to be done. There was ministry that still had to be done. There was everything that still had to be done. So I had to pull it together so that way I can continue to be the leader that, you know, I was called to be. But it was tough. Like, dang. You know what I mean? All right, you feel that way, hurry up and suck it back up. You know what I mean? Everybody's counting on you. You know, feel your way for a little bit. You know what I mean? But you got to get back at it. You got to get back and, you know, financially, you're responsible for this. You got this and going, that going. You know what I mean? You got all these problems to deal with. You're not allowed to feel. So I held a lot of that in, you know, and there's times where I'm just randomly driving. I remember the other day, man, I you know, my mom still saved in my favorites. You know, I still haven't taken her out. I feel like deleting her from my favorites. It's like deleting her from my life. So I remember there was something I was getting ready to call her about. And it's like I hit her number like, oh, dang, I just tried to call mom again. You know, and just those things. I mean, it's been, you know, 7 months. It was in January early this year, you know, and still at this point, just still feeling that. So we talked a lot about emotionalism. What does that look like? You know, how do we express our emotions? So sometimes it's through art, sometimes it's through music, sometimes it's through dance, you know what I mean? And sometimes it's just be real, sometimes it's through anger, right? Sometimes we take that passion and that anger and we put it out in sports, you know what I mean? Or we put it out somewhere else, or boxing or football or something aggressive, right? Rather than dealing with what we're actually feeling, what we just transition what we're feeling and all of that energy into something else. So, and that we were just real and raw about feelings, emotions, and everything else. And to make it all better, you know, we had an opportunity to really, eat and fellowship together. So shout out to B&K Smokehouse. Shout out again. I know I got a lot of plugs in here, but B&K Smokehouse, they're off of Main Street near downtown. Make sure you check them out. Some of the best ribs in the city. I don't eat pork, don't eat red meat. So I get their turkey ribs, and man, we ate their turkey ribs, mac and cheese. We had some chicken wings. There was greens as well. And then we just loaded it all out with some food and snacks. So listen, man, overall, it was a great event. But the purpose and the main purpose of the event, and shout out also, you know, so my girlfriend was out there and she helped me to set up. I mean, she was there from the beginning, believing in the dream, believing in the vision. So shout out to Raven Woody for being there as well. Listen, and holding it down and helping me out, taking names, setting up stuff, being there early. Like, that takes a lot. You know, so there's a lot that happens behind scenes, and after time we don't see what's going on behind scenes. So, you know, just want to give a shout out to her as well. You know, all the way from the top to the bottom, right? Understanding the vision, understanding the call. So for being there. So shout out and thank you again for being there. So yeah, man, a lot of people afterwards, there was a lot of great responses back from it. And a lot of people had a lot of questions about, BOR, what's next, right? Man, I want to come to the next one. Like, there was a lot of men there, and everybody there was asking about the next event, the next thing. What is BOR? Help me to understand and, you know, explain a little bit more to me. So without further ado, I want to let you all in on a little bit about the BOR concept, where it came from, where it is now, and where we want to go with it. So by the way, make sure you check us out on our website. You can go to bor-kingdom.com. Again, that's bor-kingdom.com. And check us out on there. You can get a little bit more information. So business or relationship, the concept really kind of came from, you know, and it's a little bit of a tricky situation, you know, for me and just people around me, where a while ago, you know, experiencing divorce, right, and coming out of the pandemic and everything else, right. And so there was a part for me like, man, what is going on with the relationships, you know what I mean, in America or just around the world, right? And at the same time, I was going through my relationship woes, right? I was talking to a lot of my friends who were going through the same exact thing, right? And whether they had, most of them, if not all of them, all had families, right? Which means kids were involved. So now, and those that may not have ended that way were this close, right? Super close to ending that way, you know, with all the high emotions and everything else that's been, you know, just going on in society, and taking a look at how high the divorce rates are right now, right? And so I had an opportunity to really think through on like what is impacting our community right now. Right. And it's family relationships. Right. So, complete families, a mother and a father being there together. Right. And sticking it in and holding it in together. The trajectory of what happens when, following divorce. Right. And following family split ups and following those sorts of things. And so, when I was in my doctoral program, and so finalizing and finishing up some stuff for my doctorate. So super excited about that. So, but the focus was on marriage and family, and I decided to focus on that within mental health because that's kind of what I felt led from God. Like, man, there's a lot of stuff being impacted from families, a lot of broken families, a lot of broken people because of broken families. Right. And how much would we be able to really help and impact people if if people weren't as broken from the family standpoint. And one of the major things that, I came up within some of my research was the structures of family, right? That a lot of the things that we're really, just struggling with were not only there's always the situations and the frustrations and all the other stuff that come up, like that's in there, right? That's there. The major issues that a lot of people were facing were just like from the expectation standpoint and the structures and the standards of how families were built and how they are constructed, right? So you had back in the day, you had your previously you kind of had that structure of family where, the father was the provider, right? He was the protector, the provider. He went to work. He brought home the money, paid the bills. He did this, that, and the other. It was as clear as could be, right? And then mom, the women were expected to work at home, right? Take care of the home, make sure the children got to school, pack lunches, vacuum, clean, all the domestic stuff, right? There was a balance between what was expected. May not have always been, fully balanced, right? But it was always like, when I say balance, it wasn't always in some people's mind equal, but there was a balance to it, right? Well, as women entered into the workforce, right, it created a different dynamic on family structures. Right. And so women started to make their own money. Women started to become their own providers. Right. And going to work. And then women started working on their own cars. Right. And so now what happens is we have a, kind of like this transition of power of sorts where, the roles of relationships weren't as defined. And so a lot of people just struggling with that where, well, hey, what do I need a man for, if I can make my own money? What do I need a woman for if I can do X, Y, and Z? Right. And so now within that, the preparations and, back in the day, moms used to sit with daughters, in the kitchen and say, hey, let me teach you how to cook. You got to make sure you can cook for your man. You got to make sure, let me show you how to clean. Right. And then on the other end, Father, let me show you how to, fix stuff and repair stuff and make sure you get up. I'll show you how to wake up for work and get to work and you work yourself and make sure you provide and you bring the money home and blah, 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 blah. Right. That's what it was. Well, that's not where we are. In many situations. So because, economically, we, it's a two income system in many, many, many homes, and most homes more than not, right? The standard of kind of where we are requires, two incomes coming in order to really, really kind of have that opportunity at life, through savings and college and, investing and, all of that other stuff. So, because of that and because of where we are now, we have a different kind of imbalance within, a lot of relationships, so for a lot of men where they struggled was, well, hey, wife still does the stuff at home. I still go to work, so you still need to cook and clean and blah, 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 blah. And wife's like, well, hey, listen, I'm working too, so I'm working and on top of that, still doing this, that, and the other. Where's the balance and how do we create balance within this? And so where a lot of people kind of had that struggle was, what does this look like now? Right. You work, I work, we have kids together, we have a family we're trying to do. What does it look like now? There's not the domesticated role. There's not just the provider role and the protector role. Like, and you have some situations where the woman is making more than the man. So now what? What does that look like? So, going back to the drawing board, I decided and God kind of showed me like, man, let's break this down, in a business sense. I was like, business? What does business have to do with relationships? And so from there, God kind of showed me like the structure and the breakdown, right, of relationships. And within that, taking a look at it from the perspective of some of the top 4 roles within an organization, right? Within any company. And so God began to show me like, well, what would happen if we structured our family structure like a business, right? Not necessarily, just your 2 roles where, mother, father, and children, but like a business. I was like, interesting, right? So from this concept came, taking a look at those top 4 roles. So for those that, a lot of you've heard these terms before, but putting it all together for you. So some of the top 4 pillars, and there's a 5th pillar that we'll focus on as well. But those top 4 pillars, right, within that organizational role. So your CEO, your CFO, your director of HR, and then also your what did I say? COO, CFO, CEO, and director of HR, right? So you have those top 4 positions, right? So now if we structure the family structure in that sense, now what happens is you have those 4 roles. Well, let's take a look at those 4 roles, right? As the CEO's responsibility is to cast out the vision, right? You cast the vision out for everybody. What does that look like? Where are we headed? Where are we going? Where are our projections? Where do I see our family structure, our business kind of going, within the next 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, 1 year, right? That's the role of the CEO. Their role is also, within that, to make, to create strategies for leadership, right? Decision making, get stakeholders together, right? Communication, like took a look at, company performance and company oversight, performance oversight, right? And the CEO is ultimately responsible for the success or the failure of the business. Sounds like how, God made it for man to be at the end of the day on the relationship that you're responsible, for your family, right? So now we take a look at the other position, which is the chief operating officer, right? And so what is the role? What are the roles of the chief operating officer? They oversee the day-to-day operations, right? Their internal management, execution of the company strategy, right? So they look at the CEO's vision and say, hey, how do we carry out the CEO's vision, right? This is the vision that you've given us, and now we're going to carry it out. Everybody is now responsible, for carrying out this vision, right? And they translate that CEO's vision, right? They create and make an actionable plan to make sure that the CEO's vision is carried out. Then you have your CFO, right? Obviously, CFO, your chief financial officer, at the end of the day, they're responsible for all finances through the company. So what income is coming in, what expenses are going out, and the goal is to keep everybody and keep everything within the positive, right? So how do we keep everything within the positive? Right. So creating those structures, to make sure that, as a business, that it's not a failing business. A large portion of businesses fail within their first couple of years. So if you look at a lot of those family structures, things like that, a lot of families fail within those first couple of years because there's a lot of principles that are missing, right? All the way from CEO to CFO, right? And that operations piece as well. So as you take a look at that CFO position, who's responsible for the finances, things that are going in, our investments, our, where are we parking our money? How are we creating this wealth? What does that look like, right? The CEO may cast the vision, and be over, oversight and responsibility over that financial, decisions and taking a look at what's happening. But the CFO essentially is responsible for that plan, and making sure that that financial plan is in place. And then you take a look at your director of HR. Right. Who's handling, the complaints, who's handling, the issues, who's handling, when things happen, who's handling those different things when, if you take a look at, for those that have family, right, they're looking at the children as employees, right? So when we're looking at the children as employees, who is handling those complaints, whether it's, children battling and fighting each other, right? Whether it's, issues at school, whether it's, issues with the teacher. Right. Or maybe, poor performance in, in schoolwork or other things. Right. So now you're taking a look at that. And now we have to take a look at HR policies. What does our employee policy say? Hey, at the end of the day, if you don't have good grades, you don't have a cell phone. That's our employee policy. Right. And so now it's mandated, and it's, the director of HR, is overcharged and overseeing those policies that everyone is holding to their standards and the employee, standards. This is what you're responsible for upholding and responsible for doing. Are you doing so? right? So you have those 4 roles: that CEO, that CFO, that COO, and your director of, HR. And we can get down to it later. The director of marketing. That's something a little bit later. But focusing on those 4 pillars now, what were to happen if we were to take that structure, and we were to take that business structure and apply it to our families, right? So that's where BOR and the concept of BOR came, is that the business of relationship. What does that look like? And how do we break it down? So there's a full breakdown. There's, workshops we have coming up. We have some men's retreats. We have women's retreats that'll be coming up as well. We have some couple events. So currently we're working on a couples comedy dinner showcase as well. So, a way of just bringing couples together and just adding to that piece, couples workshops as well. So there's a lot of great stuff on the way. And I'm super excited to be working with. I have several officials within the city, mental and behavioral health specialists, family therapists, financial specialists, so you name it, who I've shared the vision with, and they're all on board and say, hey, listen, this will be revolutionary for our community, as a whole. When I say our community, it's all inclusive, right, of our community. So I'm super excited to release business of relationship. I'm excited, for this podcast as well. So wanted to take some time and talk a little bit through our men's event, our men's discussion event, but then also talk a little bit through what BOR is, kind of the history of BOR, where it came from, the concepts, and then kind of where we're going in the future. So, stay tuned, to the podcast. Feel free, put your comments down below. Feel free to keep an eye out for events that we have coming out. When we have it, we have limited seating, so make sure you sign up. Again, this is something that's revolutionary. I know the concept seems easy enough that you can listen to one podcast and be like, oh, we got it already. Trust me. There's some algorithms that are created. There's some other things created, and as we go along, that will help, to really bring some more. Doesn't mean that, that we're perfect on the end, on the relationship end. You're talking to somebody that, been divorced. Listen, I'm not saying I'm perfect, within the relationship standpoint, but this, how God has given me the vision of this structure and some of the things that are put in place and the people that have come around, to create a holistic vision for this. You don't want to miss out. So stay tuned for the BOR podcast coming up. Stay tuned for more information on our upcoming events. Don't forget to check us out on our website. That's BOR-kingdom.com. All right, everybody, this is your host, Mike Bell. I thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for listening up, and be sure to check us out. I'll catch you on the next podcast.